Hello, everyone. I'm Carol Massar, Bloomberg Business Week on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg TV. I'm delighted to be talking again with the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, Dr. Rajiv Shah. Raj, it is so good to have you here because I know you guys are having, like so many of us, a year like no other. You're busy because there is so much that ails us at this time. We have, of course, the global health pandemic. We have the inequities in our society. We see these divisions, these gaps, whether it's wealth gaps or healthcare gaps that have just been widened because of the pandemic. You at the Rockefeller Foundation have been working on these kinds of situations for decades, for years. But tell me how this year is like no other, and perhaps maybe provide some opportunities for us to do better going forward.
Well, thank you, Carol. It's wonderful to be with you. And you're right. This year has been like no other. The Rockefeller Foundation has been around for 107 years and played a role in the pandemic of 1918. So maybe I can't say like no other ever, but certainly in recent times, this has been an extraordinarily tragic year. And it's tragic because basically this crisis, COVID-19, which is fundamentally a public health crisis, has exposed and exacerbated the deep inequities in the society in the United States and, frankly, around the world. I mean, we've seen that over and over and over again. Minority communities in the US and around the world are hit so much harder by COVID in terms of morbidity, mortality, death rates, and the like. And we know that economically, the consequences for those at the very top have been manageable. In fact, America's billionaires have probably gained almost $1 trillion of wealth in the digital acceleration that has been unlocked through this period of time. But most Americans and working families are just getting crushed with 20 million unemployment claims on a regular basis, and with the fact that I don't know, 60% of American households, more than half, went into this crisis before anyone ever tested positive, without the ability to muster $400 to deal with an emergency. And this has been a critical emergency that has exposed how extraordinarily unstable our society is when it becomes so inequitable.
So how do we, because what I'm finding is we're all talking about, okay, we know the inequities that are out there. They've been there for a long time, but they've been really pronounced in 2020 here. So how do we make sure that when we look back 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we make sure that we have set the course to put us, the world and its citizens, on a better course, that we don't look back and say, we missed an opportunity to help the climate, to help individuals, to make the world more prosperous?
Well, the good news is there's so many times in our history where we have said we're going to reimagine a different future and work to make that happen. And we absolutely have to do that right now. We cannot recover to the status quo or recover to what happened before COVID-19 hit our country and our planet. The reality is that was just too fragile and too inequitable of a society on a freight train towards disastrous climate change outcomes. So we've been asking ourselves, well, how can you reimagine the future? We can actually imagine a future where 2 to 3 billion people who are fundamentally left behind by globalization are brought into a global economy based on big investments in renewable electrification and inclusive growth in country after country. In wealthy nations, we're making those kinds of investments right now. We have to do it smartly. Otherwise, we're going to waste this once in a lifetime opportunity to put 20 to 30% of GDP back into the economy in the form of economic stimulus. But the opportunity is there to re-envision the future and build back to a condition that's both more inclusive and fundamentally more sustainable.
Well, and, talk to us about some of the work that you guys are doing, because you, from what I understand, you are making specifically a commitment when it comes to fossil fuels.
Yeah, well, I know many of the participants in this conference are investors and business leaders, and we, like other partners within the Rockefeller ecosystem, are making a commitment to effectively remove our investments in fossil fuels. And over time, we manage an endowment about $4.5 billion. Over time, we've brought down our fossil fuel exposure to something very, very small, and we will divest of direct investments in fossil fuels because it's not consistent with the future we imagine and the future we're working so hard to achieve on behalf of a sustainable planet. In doing so, we actually are following the footsteps of our sister organization, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and so many other courageous members of the Rockefeller family that have come out publicly as heirs of the traditional Standard Oil fortune, and made the point that society needs to rethink growth, capitalism, and sustainability for the future. So we're proud to follow in those footsteps.
You know, it's interesting. We talk so much at Bloomberg about, you can really make a difference by what you do with your money, how you spend it as an individual, as a corporation, the supply chains you work with, as an investor, what you invest in. We know ESG has really taken off this year specifically. So talk to me too about the role of investors in kind of this plan that you envision, this mission that you are setting out, that where we can look at the pandemic, look at the climate, look at the energy poverty that the world, a big bulk of our world is dealing with, how we can make it better, improve those three pillars. But what's the role of investors in all of this? What's the role of leaders in all of this?
Well, leadership is where this all starts, and investors just have to be more, have to own the leadership mantle much more significantly. If there's one thing we've seen, is you simply cannot count on public sector leadership from government to solve all of our problems. And so, I would encourage all the investors here to just make the simple pledge that you'll look at your portfolio and demand that you're proud of everything you're investing in from the perspective of its overall impact on society. That's ultimately what ESG investing is all about. And you could even go farther than that and look for very specific instruments that have unique social benefits. Many years ago, I was involved in creating something called the International Finance Facility for Immunization, basically one of the world's first social impact bonds. And just yesterday, the Financial Times reported that that instrument was reapplied to raise $500 million from capital markets to immunize in developing countries and make sure they get the COVID vaccine. So adventurous investors can look for sort of safe, structured, reasonable ROI investments like that and be even more active than simply checking the box on ESG investments as they run their portfolios.
But I think what's also interesting, right? We've seen all these relief packages come out, Raj, from governments, right? And I know in the U.S. we're trying to potentially get another one through. The EU has come out too, specifically a lot of money to commit to improving the lives and helping reduce some of the impact because of COVID. But we can take that money and use it in a smart way, correct?
Well, we can and we have to, because we're not going to get this chance again. I mean, just to put it in perspective, most industrial countries in the OECD have been able to do somewhere between 20 and 30% of GDP as stimulus for recovery, for dealing with the crisis itself, in terms of just an economic infusion into their economies. The EU has set the mark for saying that, okay, 30% of that commitment of more than, I think it was 28% of total GDP, is going to be used for green recovery. And that's I think, a great example of what countries need to do across the board. So as we in the United States start debating what a real recovery package looks like, making sure that it is implemented in a manner that drives sustainability and that it reaches a scale that actually will lead to an inclusive and green recovery is critical. I would also make the point, though, that while rich countries are able to do 20 to 30% of GDP, large emerging markets have done 6%, and lesser developed countries, about 70 nations around the world that hold billions of people in their population, have done 2%, 2% of GDP. That is an absolute disaster. What that means is over a decade, you'll see even more divergence between the haves and the have-nots, even more instability from nations that are already fairly precarious and simply not able to enjoy the benefits of globalization and growth and economic participation. And so we have been advocating for $1 trillion green recovery specifically for those lesser developed countries. And that's a recovery package, actually, that can be implemented by existing institutions, the International Monetary Fund, multilateral development banks, and it can be done at very minimal cost to industrial countries that are the shareholders of that institution. So this is the time for bold action. The bold action has not yet reached much of the world, and we have to make sure we make that happen.
How do we make that happen? Is it collaboration of governments, private partnerships, investors, everybody, kind of all the stakeholders having a seat at the table and pushing it forward?
Yeah, I think it's two big things. I mean, first, you're going to have to see strong, coordinated public leadership. We saw some degree of that kind of leadership coming out of the global financial crisis, and Gordon
Hmm.
Brown and President Obama really drove a global effort. But even that led to hugely inequitable outcomes with very, very slow growth as austerity measures really took hold in Europe and elsewhere for the decade after the crisis. So this time we have to learn from that experience and understand that now is our moment to make big, bold investments. This is the only chance we're going to get to make sure that a reasonable percentage, the EU target of 30%, goes into a green recovery and green infrastructure, and that it's done in an inclusive way that doesn't leave out 70 countries around the world just because they don't have central banks and they don't have the domestic wherewithal to protect their populations. After World War II, the United States looked around and saw a Western Europe in an absolute state of precarious
Hmm.
demise and launched a Marshall Plan because we understood that our long term stability was dependent on lifting up Western Europe to higher living standards, democratic governance, and to become real trading partners. That's the mindset we need now. This isn't really charity. This is about investing in the long term stability of the global economic system by recognizing that this time around, the recovery has to be inclusive and it has to be green. And we've tried to pioneer a few ideas to help make that happen.
What's slowing it down right now? Because it seems to me so logical, but I can also see policymakers in different countries just say, well, listen, we're just trying to make sure our people have food on the table. I can't think about these green initiatives. What's your answer to something like that?
Yeah, I'd say that global cooperation is at a real all-time low.
Yeah.
I believe that a change in administration in the United States, no matter what you think of the actual policy constructs and politics, will lead to improved global cooperation. I served as the head of USAID under President Obama, and the reality is I just saw firsthand how this world needs American leadership. And so if America retracts and says we're going to go it alone, the natural tendency to come together and tackle big global problems with a sense of shared urgency gets lost. We have to rebuild that, and we have to rebuild it starting with American participation and Chinese participation against these efforts.
I want to go back to collaboration and public-private partnerships. I mean, Raj, you guys at the Rockefeller Foundation, you've done this. You've got programs in India and Africa where you've been able to pull, whether you work with Tata and some others, where you're actually, we're talking about a lot of things, and I think people are like, okay, these are concepts. No, you've actually done it, and it works, and it makes a difference. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, the way we work is we embrace public-private partnerships that help lift people out of poverty and create inclusive growth. And so I'm glad you mentioned the Tata Power partnership. It's a joint venture between the Rockefeller Foundation and Tata Power to basically bring renewable energy in the form of solar mini grids to people who don't have electricity. And most people would say, well, gosh, everybody has electricity. Actually, that's
Mm-mm.
not true. A billion people on Earth don't have any meaningful electrification. They don't even have the electricity to turn lights on in their homes consistently. Another 2 billion people on top of that experiences their primary constraint to growth, employment, and labor productivity improvements, the lack of access to reliable energy for industrial purposes and the like. And so what has changed is for probably 50 to 100 years, the mindset of how you achieve electrification has been you build a big coal plant, you connect it to a massive grid, you have a public utility run the whole thing, and you invest a lot of government money. That's still true in some places. But in most places now, thanks to technology and some business models that Rockefellers helped pioneer in places like India and Myanmar and East Africa, we now know that you can start a small solar mini grid business and sell productive power to the world's poorest people on a commercially viable basis. And I was in India in November before we had to stop traveling and met with women who were our customers. And frankly, they were paying 26, 27 cents a kilowatt hour for power. They were happy to do it because it allowed them to run sewing machines or power tools or construction equipment or rice hulling equipment for their post-harvest processing. And they were lifting their families and their kids out of poverty. And our Tata program is $1 billion joint venture that is currently building out 10,000 of these mini grids, doing it using modern technology, AI for remote management, smart meters for billing people appropriately. And we estimate that's going to help 25 million people in India move out of poverty. That can be replicated across Africa, in other parts of Asia, and in Latin America. And we're now in a series of partnerships to do just that.
What's interesting is I think about the virus. I've said this a million times on air. It has taught us that we need to think about community, right? I mean, the whole idea of wearing a mask, it's, yeah, protecting yourself, but protecting really others. And I do think this sense of community in terms of what you are talking about, that if we can help raise up individuals, by giving them power, I mean, they become part of our global economy, and it ultimately is about creating prosperous lives for them, but also a prosperous world, correct? I mean, there's a reason why we want to kind of raise everyone up.
Yeah, I'd say prosperous and stable. I spent a
And
lot of
stable.
time in Afghanistan where American foreign assistance, which accounted for less than 2% of the cost of the Afghan war, paid for and allowed 8 million girls to go to school. Those 8 million girls will grow into women who lead that nation long after American troops have left. America famously, after the Korean War, made big investments in reconstructing an economy in South Korea. And we've now seen South Korea as one of our largest trading partners, accounting for more jobs in the United States than our trade with the country of France. So, in the same way, I think we have to think of this not as charity, but say we have in this moment the opportunity to bring 2 to 3 billion people truly into a productive modern economy. That massive influx of labor, of ingenuity, of talent has the potential to sustain genuine economic growth, job creation in our nation for many, many decades to come. And frankly, we have a chance to do it sustainably. We have a chance to do it with renewable energy. We have a chance to do it where new battery technologies. I mentioned a project that was successful at 27 cents a kilowatt hour. This year, we'll have the price down to 15 cents a kilowatt hour simply because of technological advances, mostly in energy storage, but also some other areas. That's the mindset we need. Where can we innovate? Where can we invest? How can we build a more inclusive and a more sustainable future? Because, Carol, the alternative we see, China today is investing in 102 gigawatts of new coal-fired production of electricity in 27 nations, all of which are the types of countries the Rockefeller Foundation works actively in. That's the alternative. And frankly, we need to come together with China and say, let's do this in a manner that's green. Let's make sure it's inclusive. And let's rethink globalization so that it's not just for those who already have a lot, but it's really a ladder up for billions of people who don't.
Raj, I'm glad you brought up China because, as everyone said, whatever issue that's out there, that's, any major global issue, you can't think about China and their role in this. Do we need to have China obviously be a part of this and be part of the communication and the actions in order for it to really make a difference?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, look, China is the second most important economy in the world, and soon will be the biggest. And in reality, in a multipolar world, you need real U.S.-Chinese cooperation on big international efforts, and a true global green recovery will require and demand Chinese participation. The good news is, China launched the Belt Road Initiative. That's the closest thing that the world has today to a Marshall Plan. I think Chinese leaders have spoken in detail about their understanding of building a global environment that is connected to and from which they both contribute and benefit. The question is, can you do it better? When we did the Marshall Plan, we did it with a lot of American companies. The Belt Road Initiative is very heavily focused on Chinese finance and Chinese companies and certain Chinese technologies like coal, and sort of evolving beyond that to embrace the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, for example, and all the transactions that are done under the BRI, to embrace real renewable electrification strategies for the bottom 2 to 3 billion people around the world, to embrace genuine partnerships with other industrial nations in expanding the remit of that effort and approaching it in a really cooperative way. It can either be a threat to American leadership around the world, or it can be an opportunity to collaborate and build a global community that is far more inclusive, far more sustainable, and as I've seen firsthand in some very tough places, also more stable, more safe, more secure. And that is the world we need to build, and we need to show some leadership to get there.
Okay, so all right, so we've done a lot of talking. You've talked about kind of the tools are there, right? We've learned from the financial crisis. I'm thinking of leaders who are listening, investors who are listening. So what is it, one piece of advice, one action item or two action items that you think people need to like kind of go back to their offices, go back to their home, working from home, and just say, these are things we need to work on so that we can build a better future, a greener future, but that's also very beneficial to the world at large?
Well, I'd say the one big thing, and no matter what walk of society you're part of and what part of the business community you're part of, is just really understanding how are you providing value towards a sustainable and inclusive economy. Really having a crisp understanding of that and making sure you're investing in the right things in that regard. Part of it, then there are more specific recommendations. Everyone should be thinking about ESG investments, and that should be a significant portion of the portfolio. Anyone managing an endowment should look seriously at divestment and understand that, whether they can make that happen within the contours of their institution and take on that responsibility. I think anyone who is running a larger or even a smaller operating company of some type should be looking to see, are they able to turn their corporate engine into an engine of service delivery and growth for those who have been excluded from the last decade of economic performance, and frankly, the last 4 decades in the United States, and those that are getting crushed during this COVID crisis, which includes essential workers in America. And there are infinite opportunities, especially for many of our tech champions, to rethink how they are treating their employees, what it means to be a gig worker, how you maintain flexibility, but also provide the essentials that create for dignified work, healthcare, education for children, real notification of the time you're asked to work, and respect for the time you're waiting for a car ride to pop up on your app and you go pick somebody up. As the economy changes, we need corporate leaders and investors to take much more leadership over these issues, and everyone has a role to play if you really think about how you are affecting the nature of the future of our economy.
If we all do this, right, and if we all think about these 3 major problems that you laid out, the pandemic, climate, and also talked about energy poverty, if we do this and get it right, what do you think will be the outcome, and in what time frame?
Well, we're convinced that you can end energy poverty in a decade. And while that might sound like it's one slice, it's one of many problems, we actually know that it is the most correlated issue that keeps people trapped in poverty and that robs people, especially in developing nations, of their capacity to improve their human productivity. So solving that problem in the next decade can literally bring billions of people out of poverty into a modern global economy, enable them to use digital tools and have access to growth, opportunity, and dignity that comes with income and upward mobility. I think that's a major, major win for humanity. I think second, acting now on and recognizing that the stimulus actions we take are once in a lifetime actions effectively, especially for anyone in public service, because lifetime is short in public service. Getting this right matters, and we have to learn from the global financial crisis. We cannot have a slow and sluggish set of actions that effectively leave out the bottom 60% of working households in the industrial world. Our politics won't sustain that in the future.
It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We've got to get this right. Are you optimistic that we will?
I am. I'm an optimist. I've seen us rush to create a vaccine, 3 of them potentially for COVID. I've actually, over the course of 20 years, seen us vaccinate hundreds of millions of kids who would have otherwise missed those vaccinations because of real public private partnership. We're embarking on this fight against energy poverty with the support of the world's largest energy companies and the world's smallest energy storage innovators. I mean, people have a yearning to make a difference in the world. And somewhere along the way, capitalism and corporate culture kind of puts that yearning in a box. And if we can reconnect people to their sense of purpose and help them recognize that their actions now will define, the planet in the future, and give
Right.
them a chance to look back on what they did in this moment with pride, I'm very optimistic that we'll succeed.